In the previous video, we looked at Lada's most problematic prototypes. Today, we're looking at the ones that were genuinely successful. Cars that never made it into production not because they were bad, but because they were simply never given a chance. This is a story about Lada's missed opportunities. The first genuinely successful Lada prototype that never made it into production appeared in 1976. It was a station wagon based on the luxury version of the Lada 2103. What's interesting is that even during the development of the 2103 itself, Fiat engineers had already proposed a luxury wagon version. But at the time, Lada's management rejected that idea. They only came back to it a few years later. In 1976, 3 such cars were built on the production line. Their purpose was simple: to check whether the model met European requirements and to evaluate its export potential. And this is where things get strange. For unknown reasons, the project was never approved for mass production. And this was a serious missed opportunity. The export prospects for a car like this were very real, especially in Europe. Station wagons have always been popular there, and a relatively affordable luxury wagon from Lada would almost certainly have found buyers. Most likely, the decision was influenced by how station wagons were viewed on Lada's domestic market. At home, they were seen as purely utilitarian and not very prestigious, unlike sedans. Either way, a station wagon that was already almost fully localized for production never made it into series. And without exaggeration, this was a major missed opportunity. The same category also includes a modernization of the 2103 proposed by Porsche for export markets, which Lada's management ultimately rejected as well. Another extremely interesting project started in that same year, 1976. The Soviet Ministry of Defense commissioned Lada to develop a vehicle for company commanders. According to the technical brief, it was meant to be a purely military vehicle, but unlike many other military projects, this one was not fully classified. It was called the Lada 2122 Reka, and in official documents, it was described as a vehicle for fishermen and hunters. The Soviet military leadership had a long-standing fascination with amphibious vehicles. It was believed that the ability to cross rivers and swamps without pontoon bridges was a strategic advantage. That's why the Lada Reka was designed as an amphibious vehicle. I won't go into technical details here. I'm planning to dedicate a separate episode to this car. But the core idea is hard to overstate: an off-roader based on the Niva, with its off-road capability, that could also float. This wasn't just an interesting concept, it was a genuinely promising platform, especially in civilian form and especially for export markets. In simple terms, the Lada Reka should have become a production model without any real reservations. But, as so often happens, it never made it into production. And next, Lada's electric cars. The most interesting project here was called Pony, a whole series of experimental electric vehicles. The first prototype, with the index 1801, was an open 4-seater, officially positioned as a vehicle for resort areas. Although in reality, it was most likely just a platform for testing the technology, and it was probably never seriously intended for mass production. In 1980, a much more serious version appeared, an electric van with a boxy layout and a plastic body. It was designed as a city service vehicle for mail delivery, municipal services, and urban logistics. The van was equipped with a 25-kilowatt electric motor, rear-wheel drive, a top speed of around 50 kilometers per hour, and a payload capacity of 500 kilograms. The lead-acid batteries alone weighed about 500 kilograms. It was precisely the immaturity of the technology at the time that prevented this van from becoming a production model. At the same time, its exterior deserves a special mention. It looked both toy-like and timeless. Even today, a design like this would still look perfectly appropriate. Later on, other electric vans appeared with the same technical layout, but different designs. Unfortunately, none of them ever became production models, or even limited-run vehicles. And that's especially disappointing because Lada could realistically have achieved a small but meaningful technological breakthrough. Commercially, these vehicles probably would not have been successful, but as a technical experiment, they could very well have gone down in history. However, all work on the Pony project was officially shut down in 1988. Now it's time to talk about the Niva prototypes. The paradox of the Niva is that no one ever planned to keep it on the production line for this long. Think about it. The car's been in production for almost half a century, and more importantly, it still has steady demand today. But back in the 1980s, no one could have predicted that. That's why the first plans to update the Niva started appearing as early as 1985. The first full-scale model was still a three-door. Inside, it used a lot of the fashionable black plastic of that era. Yes, it was technically just a mock-up, not a full prototype, but it clearly shows how Lada's designers imagined the new Niva at the time. The next full-size mock-up was shown in 1988. This time it was already a five-door. Once again, the design reflected the spirit of its time. No longer the boxy 1970s, but not yet the bio-design style of the 1990s either. In the years that followed, several more mock-ups were built in a similar style, including a pickup. But after that, the project effectively stalled. Meanwhile, time kept passing, and a new generation Niva still failed to appear. It wasn't until 1995 that the first real prototypes of the next generation Niva finally emerged. Their design was now shaped in the fashionable bio-design style of the time. This time, the project actually made it into production, although only in 2002, and under the Chevrolet brand. That was when the original Niva lost its historic name. The rights to the brand went to General Motors, and the old model was renamed the Lada 4x4. Only relatively recently was the name Niva finally brought back. And characteristically, even after the launch of the Chevrolet Niva, the original Niva was never taken out of production. Both models were built in parallel. By the way, I have a separate video about the Chevrolet Niva. I'll leave a link to it in the pinned comment. Next comes a project that never really had any chance of becoming a production car, because it was designed from the start as an image product, with no real intention of going into series. But leaving the Lada Roadster concept out of this video would have been strange. The concept appeared in 2000, during a very difficult period for the company. Yes, Lada managed to survive the brutal crisis of the 1990s and keep production alive. But beyond that, there was little to be optimistic about. There was only enough money to keep the old models going. There were almost no new platforms. The brand's image had fallen to rock bottom. Lada had become associated with archaic design, cheapness, and outdated technology. And against that backdrop, the company decided to remind the world that it still existed. Not at a local Moscow motor show, but straight in Geneva in 2000. The design of the Roadster concept turned out genuinely decent. There was no unnecessary flamboyance or screaming shapes. Everything looked fairly balanced. Technically, everything was predictable. The mechanical base from the Lada 2110, front-wheel drive, and performance that was, to put it mildly, not sports car level. But it was never meant for production anyway. The Roadster was a pure demonstration, a reminder that Lada was still alive and still capable of building interesting prototypes. More or less the same can be said about the Lada Peter Turbo concept, which was presented at the Paris Motor Show in that same year, 2000. Of course, there was never any talk of producing a car like that, but some of its design solutions could realistically have carried over into future models. They could have, but they didn't. Although, no, just seemed that way. It's also worth talking separately about attempts to modernize Lada's classic rear-wheel drive cars, which trace their origins back to the Fiat 124. The first such attempts were made back in the Soviet era, some successful, others less so. But one way or another, the classic lineup entered the new millennium almost without any visible external changes. And at the same time, the situation did not yet look hopeless. The Lada 2151 Classic was, in essence, the last serious attempt to replace the classic models, not with cosmetic updates, but with a full-scale modernization. The project looked logical and was technically feasible, but it sank in the same place where most reasonable Lada initiatives of the early 2000s did: money, politics, and inertia. Technically, the car was based on the rear-wheel drive Lada platform, but in a heavily reworked form. Only the engine and the rear axle remained unchanged, and even those would most likely have been modernized if the concept had made it to production. The body was completely new, without a single shared panel with previous models. And surprisingly, the exterior turned out well balanced. For the first time in a long while, the car genuinely looked like a new generation of the classic lineup, rather than just another facelift. The interior also moved far ahead. Yes, it wasn't world-class, but it was no longer Soviet antiquity either. For its class and price segment, it looked perfectly respectable. Despite the fact that the prototype was practically ready for mass production, it never made it into series. The main reason was money. Launching production required new stamping tools, molds, production line reconfiguration, and certification. All of that was expensive. At the same time, the market for rear-wheel drive cars was shrinking. Margins were minimal, and the risks were extremely high. In the end, the 2151 remained a prototype and a reminder of what Lada's classic lineup could have become. Another story is connected to attempts to replace the tiny Oka. And this is where a project appeared that clearly should have gone into production. The Lada Oka 2 was one of the most dramatic and one of the most unusually sensible Lada projects of the early 2000s. This was not a show car or a designer's fantasy, but a genuine attempt to create a proper, second-generation city microcar. By the early 2000s, the original Oka had become openly primitive. Yes, it was still the cheapest new car on the market and continued to sell reasonably well. But safety requirements were rising, competition from used foreign cars was increasing, and the image of a car for the poor was seriously damaging the brand. The Oka 2 was meant to remain just as affordable, while becoming significantly safer, more reliable, and more comfortable. Technically, everything was in place. 2 fuel-injected engines, 0.8 and 1.0 liters, a 5-speed manual transmission, a new McPherson front suspension, and a semi-independent rear axle. For its class, the equipment level was respectable, and the design turned out to be surprisingly well balanced. Without any indulgence, it could genuinely be called European in its execution. In practical terms, the car was almost ready for mass production. But the outcome followed the same pattern as with the previous project. Once again, everything came down to money, new tooling, production reconfiguration, and the associated costs. In my view, out of all the missed opportunities, the Oka 2 is the most painful one. The car was timely, logical, and had every chance to secure Lada a clear niche in the affordable city car segment. It is genuinely disappointing that it never reached production. And finally, the prototype featured on this video's thumbnail, the Lada C Concept from 2007. Technically, it belonged to the same Project C that I discussed in the previous video, a project that ended up on the list of failed prototypes. And in general, that assessment is fair. But the C Concept is an exception. While the main Project C prototype never managed to settle on a clear identity, unsure whether it was meant to look European or Asian, and ultimately ending up bland and forgettable, the C Concept did not suffer from that problem. On March 6, 2007, the experimental model was unveiled at the 77th Geneva Motor Show. The information displayed at the stand listed its specifications, including a 2.0-liter engine and a claimed top speed of 210 kilometers per hour. The design was created by young designers from Lada's technical development department, and this was, arguably, the model's strongest point. The exterior looked genuinely self-contained, without obvious borrowing or visual references to other brands. And, just as importantly, it had a muscular and expressive presence. The C Concept went down together with the rest of the Project C family in 2008, following the arrival of the Renault-Nissan alliance. And while the sedan versions from this project are not particularly missed, by most measures they were fairly mediocre, the 3-door version was canceled entirely undeservedly. What is truly surprising is something else. In the years that followed, none of the design solutions from the C Concept were ever used on any new Lada production model. And that is genuinely astonishing, how a project this strong from a design standpoint could simply be buried. Although, there are certain suspicions once again, but this time as well, it only seemed that way. And that brings this video to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next videos.